Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Board of County Commissioners Budget Workshop that we're having today. It is April 19th, and I'm officially calling the meeting to order, and we'll call on Mike Merrill to start us with our agenda.
Okay. Yes, good afternoon, Commissioners. We are in the throes of the budget process again. Never seems to end. This is the second year of a two-year budget process, so traditionally we don't make a lot of monumental changes and decisions during the second year, although there are some issues we do need to grapple with. So really today it's just to kind of update you, to also fulfill our obligation under board policy that we provide you with a 5-year projection. So Kevin Bricky will do that today. That'll give us a chance to kind of bring all the pieces together. Needs and fire rescue, parks, the homestead exemption impact. So you can kind of see it all in one place. We'll show you some different options on how to deal with it. But again, that's really for FY20, but the purpose of showing it to you this year, other than the board policy, is that we know or we expect that the homestead exemption will pass, and that will have a negative impact on our revenue. And so as we make decisions for FY19, we just need to be aware of making recurring kinds of appropriations that then might be hard to reel back in after the homestead exemption is passed. So one-time expenditures are much easier to manage, but so that's the other reason for kind of showing you this picture where we're headed. So with that, I'll ask Tom Fessler to start us off. Yes.
Okay, Commissioner Higginbotham has a question.
Thank you. When do we expect that to go into effect if it passes?
It would be 20, fiscal year 20, so
Okay.
October 1st of 19.
Okay.
Yeah, our 1920 budget.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, Tom.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tom Fessler, Director of the Management Budget Department. This afternoon, what we wanted to do is I just have a short PowerPoint presentation to go through, just kind of an overview of the budget for fiscal year 19. And then Kevin Bricky, the county's economist, will come up and give a presentation on the 5-year pro forma. So that's where we take a look out 5 years and project where we think we'll be. And then I'm going to finish up with another presentation regarding reserves. That's something we haven't typically done with you before, but we thought it'd be a good idea this year. Our reserves are about $1.2 billion out of a $5 billion budget. So because that's such a significant number, and we periodically have questions about our reserves, we thought it'd be a good idea to just go through those with you today. I've got just a couple of PowerPoint slides today to kind of break down the budget. And historically, over the last few years, I've done this using multiple slides, but I thought today I'd just do the kind of a higher level version of it with a couple of pie charts just to, again, just go through with you the county's budget at a very high level and just show how it's broken down. I know at the board meeting yesterday, a question kind of came up, and there was some discussion about the county's $5 billion budget and why it isn't actually as big as it seems when it comes to the dollars that we have that are under the discretion of the board. And that's one of the purposes I like to go through this. The first slice of the pie that I'll highlight here would be our transfers. The transfers are basically an accounting or a budgeting tool to move funds around within the budget from one place to another. So a good example of that would be if you have a checking account and a savings account and you want to move $10 from your savings to your checking account, the $10 moves from one place to another, but you haven't actually spent it. That's what transfers are, if you're looking at it in terms of the county's budget. The second slice of the pie there, which is 23%, 23.5% are reserves. I won't go into that too much right now because I have an entire presentation later on to go through the reserves with you. But basically, the reserves are the county bank account. They're dollars that are there. They can be spent on a one-time basis, but unless they're replenished with a recurring source, they are just one-time dollars. The next slice of the pie would be up there in the where it says programs funded with restricted funding sources, $1.4 billion. You can see that that's roughly 28% of the budget. And those are programs and expenditures that we're going to make where the revenues associated with those that are going to pay for those have some restrictions on them for one reason or another. And some examples of those would be in that slice of the pie, we have the water department in there. So the water department's annual budget is $560 million out of $1.4 billion. Some of the other significant programs that we have in there are the Indigent Healthcare Fund, which represents about $140 million. Debt service is up in that area. So we have debt service payments every year of about $120 million to cover our outstanding bonds. And we've got our self-insurance fund up there, which is $113 million. As you know, we're self-insured. We're allowed to do that as a government within the state of Florida. So within that area, we've probably got about $90 million related to our health insurance program. We're required to have a certain level of reserves that the state requires us to have. And then we've got our claims payments every year also, which roughly are in the neighborhood of $80 to $90 million. We've got our solid waste department up in that area, which is about $100 million. And then we have things such as grants, which is about $86 million. So when we receive grants, obviously when the grantor gives us dollars, we've applied for a grant, we say we're going to do a specific thing with the dollars that we receive, and therefore we expend the dollars. So therefore those dollars are restricted for that particular purpose. Also included in there is $37 million for Head Start, $29 million for tourist development taxes. We've got our library services department in there. That's $42 million. So as you can see, those dollars are restricted for very particular purposes. The next slice of the pie would be your constitutional officers, your boards and agencies. We have a lot of organizations funded within there that are not underneath the county administrator's purview, but are part of the county budget that we fund. That would be your sheriff's department. The sheriff's department represents about $420 million. And then we also fund the other constitutional officers, tax collector, supervisor of election, property appraiser. I'm forgetting somebody. And the clerk, sorry.
Supervisor of elections.
Supervisor of elections, yes. Then we also have our planning commission, the MPO, public defender, state attorney. So we're funding a lot of the courts organizations also. There are some Florida laws that require us to fund certain functions of the court system. So that's what falls in this area also. Next slice of the pie would be your transportation slice. About $320 million of that is for capital purposes and is included in our capital program. And then we've got about $70 million in there that represents our operating budget for transportation. So that would cover things such as pothole repairs, sidewalk and bridge maintenance, traffic signs and signals, and those types of things. The next slice is, I'm going to have two slides that go over the budget, and then the next slide is going to be the county administrator department. So I'll just say that, we've got 7% here, about $366 million. That's basically are the general funds. That's where the most discretion is in the budget, and that's why we have a kind of a separate slide that I'll use to go over that to show you where those more discretionary dollars are actually spent. Having called them discretionary, you'll see that there's not as much discretion as you would think once we start talking about the types of services that we fund. We've got our capital improvement program. That's a little misleading. It's $232 million, and what we have in that slice of the pie is our fire program, about $20 million, our government facilities, $50 million, library services, 24, parks, 94, and stormwater, 42. But also for our solid waste system and our water department, and for our transportation, those are included. They're included in this pie, but they're not in that slice of the pie for those capital programs. And then finally, we have our non-departmental area, which that's where we have some miscellaneous items that we put in that area that just don't fit nicely within one of our county departments, such as the annual county audit, some outside legal representation, some insurances, and those types of things.
Can I ask, the Transportation Trust Fund, is that part of the transportation pie or the capital improvement pie?
It's part of the transportation.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So this slide is basically.
I'm sorry, Commissioner White also has a question.
And Madam Chair, do you prefer that we ask questions as we go or at the end?
I think we should ask them as we go, because,
Okay.
we have a lot of different areas, and probably should just address them as they come up.
Okay, so on that previous pie chart, for the programs funded with restricted funding sources, we could certainly find ways to allocate some of those dollars towards certain transportation projects, right? And we probably already do in some cases.
It would depend on, I would say if there are dollars in there, they're probably pretty limited, based on the services that we fund out of there. So again, the largest piece of that is the water department. So if we receive funding for water, we wouldn't be able to use that for
Sure.
transportation. Or for the indigent healthcare fund, that's part of the sales tax that we receive, so we couldn't use that for transportation. So again, we have a lot of different programs funded in there, but I off the top of my head, I can't think of any significant dollars that would be in there that we could free up for transportation. I'm not saying there aren't any. I just have to go back and kind
Sure.
of review that.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Any other? Okay, you can continue.
And so as I go to the next slide, it's the slice on this pie that's kind of broken out a little bit. And again, these are the dollars that are basically under the county administrator departments. These are general fund dollars. And you can see that the biggest slice of the pie here has to do with things that are primarily related to public safety. It should be our fire department, pet resources, medical examiner, code enforcement. Out of this slice, fire rescue represents the biggest piece. It's probably
Commissioner Miller has a question. Sure. You recognize?
Go back to your other slide. I'm going to ask a question that Mr. White asked. Under the program funding restricted funding source, it says restricted. They're restricted for certain programs, am I correct?
That's correct.
So the answer to your question to Commissioner White is, basically when it says restricted, they should not be removed from any place else to go anyplace else. Am I right? Do we have a policy that says that?
We don't necessarily have a policy, but we'd have to look at each of the, there's a lot of funds associated with that, a lot of pieces that are in there. So I'd have to go back and look at each of those individually and determine why those funds are restricted. So if it's, for instance, the water department, we can't use funds outside of the water system.
Let me ask another question. Should we have a policy that says that they're restricted for those areas and cannot be moved anyplace else?
I would
I
say
see something
generally
coming down the road that's
if
gonna
they're
cause
in a
some problems.
separate fund, there probably is guidance out there already, either a Florida law or, again, if it's within the water system, if it's associated with like the indigent healthcare fund where it's associated with a sales tax that's been approved.
That's in
It's very
statute.
prescribed
Okay.
in most cases.
However, that's a statute, but does not cover everything that's under that area. My
Right.
question is, should we have a policy to make sure that those restricted funds stay within those restricted areas?
It certainly wouldn't hurt to at least put it in a board policy, even though other laws may govern it. I think it would add extra force.
So should we have a motion today, or should I just ask staff to bring back such policy that
Either
where
way.
areas is not enumerated in the state statute, that we have a county policy that says certain funds should stay within those restricted areas and not be allocated someplace else?
That would be helpful, yeah.
I think you can, since it's a
directly.
workshop, we usually don't do motions or things, but I definitely think any direction today it can be to staff, just like we do with future
Okay.
issues.
Can you bring that back?
Yes.
Thank you.
I
So
think
I think-
that's a good idea, Commissioner Miller.
And I'll second that non-motion.
Second and non-motion.
Yeah, I'll
No
third
vote.
it. Because with the homestead exemption probably passing,
Yeah.
everybody's going to be looking under every rock
Right.
to see where they can find $5 or $10
Yeah.
in. So I think it's a good idea.
So another way to look at this is, out of the 1.4 billion, you can take out the big ones right off the bat. The utility system, solid waste system, indigent care,
Debt service.
those, and debt service. Of the 1.4 billion, that's probably what, $1 billion? Maybe
At least.
more, at least $1 billion. Those are clearly either under state law, through agreements with bondholders, you just can't touch them.
Right.
So I think the thing that maybe would be helpful, Tom, is to later provide to the board the items in that pie slice that are restricted by board ordinance or board policy. because that's where you potentially then you could unrestrict them, but you're not restricted by state law,
Right.
federal law, contract.
But those ones that you're talking about, I think we should have a policy that restricts them.
That's where the policy would
Because
fit.
just
yeah.
like Commissioner Murma said, someone, this board might not be here per se. I'm not saying some will, some won't, but the mere fact is that if and when the homestead exemption passes and some other board comes and start
Yes.
picking it apart, then we may have a problem. I think we need to
Right.
put something in place.
Yes, that's where the policy would apply to the ones where there's an ordinance, a local law. And I think and you'll probably do this in the reserves as well. So the reserves, the 1.2 billion is a similar story. In the reserves, you've got reserves that are restricted because of external forces, state law, agreement with bondholders. There are some reserves that are restricted, but they're restricted because of policies of past boards or local decisions. And so you can hit on that as well. But I think the most important thing about this is that the three biggest pieces of the pie, transfers, reserves, and programs restricted, for the most part, 95% of them are not available to be used anywhere else for anything. And that's why it's so important that when anybody says, well, it's a $5 billion budget, it is officially, but in terms of the discretion and ability to use funding, it really is fairly limited. Constitutional officers, boards, and agencies is not really restricted. I mean, they send us their budget, we approve it, but this board has the ability to make changes to it, albeit that's difficult, but and then of course transportation and capital improvement are areas that we wouldn't want to touch anyway, because transportation's important, capital improvement's important. So you really get down to that little yellow slice that's popped out of the pie where you have most discretion. So really, a $5 billion budget boils down to $366 million in terms of real true discretion to allocate money elsewhere, with some minor exceptions in the other pie slices, so on a recurring basis. So I think that's really the importance of this. And why don't you give it
Okay,
mine?
Commissioner White has a question. You're recognized.
Where do you have the bed tax revenues within this pie chart?
Yes, that would be in the restricted area.
And that's really the one I was getting at when I asked about the restricted funds, because sometimes you can have transportation projects that are justifiably funded from those sources, right?
Under the, that would apply, I believe, only to the new 6th cent.
Right.
So 1 through 3 were not touched. That can only be used for tourist marketing and so forth. The 4th and 5th cent can be used only for debt service on professional sports facilities and for marketing. The 6th penny, which we now are eligible for, is the one that it was opened up wider to be used for things like transportation or really anything for that matter. So you're correct. That one would be one of those pieces of that pie slice that would be differentiated. And
Okay. And I for some reason, and I'm probably wrong, but for some reason I was thinking that there was sometimes an avenue whereby the 1st through 3rd cent could be spent on a transportation project if you can justify that it impacts tourism.
No, not the 1
1
through
through
3
3?
cent.
Yeah.
we'll take a look at it.
Okay.
I think, probably if there was a creative legal interpretation, you could identify a transportation project that was so specifically tailored to a tourist venue or something. I suppose you could do that, but
Okay.
other than a real sort of direct link, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
But we'll do that analysis for you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I have been listening by phone, but I have a couple questions when I look at this. And one is, so again, I know I asked over and over again last time because I can't read a budget this way. But this is a combination of the countywide and the unincorporated together, right? Because I find that not to be a useful tool in terms of really looking at how what we're spending and how it works. Having the whole budget together when they're truly two separate budgets, I think, is difficult and doesn't lend to good analysis and information. And my second, and I heard some talk about restricted funds and reserves, and I just want to say that I have believed that we should have fund by fund. The reserves should be part of that fund, that the reserves could not be used against any other fund. So I think moving forward that I would like to, I think that's fiscally prudent and would like to see that happen in the future.
Well, we do have reserve policies. The board has reserve policies that actually do that, so we can provide those to you that say it can only be used for one particular purpose.
I understand that, but like the way that we have funds in one, reserves in one fund that are used to, against reserves, are used to provide the reserves for another fund is what I'm talking about.
Gotcha. Right, okay. We can break this out between general funds for you, for the board.
The two general funds, that would be extremely helpful to me. Thank you.
Or
Okay.
they can do it. Easy for the guy who doesn't have to do it.
I know he can handle it.
So yeah, Commissioner, out of the $5 billion, the two general funds represent just over $1 billion. So it's about 20% of the budget. But we can certainly come back at future workshops and break those two funds out and give a much more.
Right, I just can't
Sure.
interpret this way.
We can certainly do that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Miller, you're recognized.
Thank you. Let me say why I brought up the mere fact, because I think we should have a policy restricting the funds being moved. Mr. Merrill, you said in the, well, go back to the first slide. You said in the funded, the program funded with restricted funding sources, 27%, which is 1.4 billion. Transfers 17%, which is 900 million, and reserves 23% at 1.2 billion. You said about 90% of that is restricted through some type of complication, a compound effort of state law and what we have right now. Having added those up, that still leaves about $800 million out there that's not restricted, which is a major, it doesn't sound much when you start talking about billions, but 800 million is a lot of money. And if it's not restricted, it could be, they'll tell them what may happen to those dollars. That's why I said that even in all those areas now, we should have a policy that basically says in those areas, those funds will be restricted for certain programs and certain funding aspects. That's why I say we need to have a policy on that. Because $800 million that can be moved willy-nilly, it may cause some problems.
Right. Yes.
Okay, see no further questions. You can proceed.
That was a popular slide, Tom.
Well, that's the whole pie.
Yeah, again, I used to go through this in about 12 to 15 slides, and I've broken it down to 2. So, this next slide is just basically that one slice that's pulled out. That's the departments under the county administrator. It's their general fund dollars, and you can see that's $366 million. Fire rescue again is about 160 million of the 205, and the largest slice of the pie there. And then you can see we've got some other types of services. You've got your slice of the pie that relates to basically your parks programs. Then you've got a slice of the pie that relates to a lot of our human services type programs, children's services, aging services, and so on. We've got our strong economy slide with affordable housing, development services, economic development, and finally we have our fleet and public works breakout there. Just to give you an idea on some of the projections that we have for the upcoming year as far as revenue growth, When we're looking at the countywide and unincorporated area ad valorem, we use multiple sources to forecast those. Kevin will go over some of those projections and our forecast in a few minutes. But we are projecting, again, very strong growth in ad valorem this year in relation to recent years, somewhere over the 8% range. We update those estimates all the way through the budget process. We will get final numbers from the property appraiser's office. We'll get initial numbers on June 1, final numbers, I believe it's on July 1. And you can see that the communication services tax is about 2%. That's a funding source that's we struggle with a little bit because of the changes in technology. That one's been relatively flat over the last few years. Half-cent sales tax, that's a pretty strong number at 4.4%. Historically, we're probably more, around the 4% range. And then state revenue sharing growth at about 5%. For about $66 million, $67 million in growth dollars that we're seeing for the upcoming year that would be available for various uses. And then having talked about uses, just to give you an idea of the types of things that we anticipate that some of those dollars will be used for, we've got increases from our constitutional officers. We've got tax collector property appraiser commissions. Those are by statute, so we just do a calculation there, and those dollars are committed. We've got our transportation plan. The board recently approved a new agreement or an updated agreement with Strategic Property Partners and the City of Tampa CRA. So we've got some additional commitments there over the next 4 years or so. We did identify this last hurricane season that we have some needs. One of the things I don't have on here, and I should, is we've got, first of all, the hardened facilities, which is basically to harden certain of our public works fleet and public utilities facilities in anticipation or to prepare us for future storms. But then also we've identified some other emergency management type needs that will be probably coming back to you before the end of the year to address. And then for some of those things will be in next year's budget. We always have things like the Florida retirement system, tax increment financing, which are basically the CRAs, so payments to the cities. And then one of the things we always try to take a look at is when we're looking at our reserves and we're trying to maintain, we have a new fund balance and reserve policy, we try to maintain those general fund reserves around 20%. Well, obviously, if we have growth and we have added revenue and added expenditures, that would suggest that we need to proportionally increase our reserves, or at least look at proportionally increasing our reserves and whether or not we should in a given year.
Thanks. Tom, we have a question of the commissioner. Commissioner White, you're recognized.
Very briefly, and I think you've touched on it and answered my question, but the piece for strategic property partners, that's completely related to that last agenda item that we passed a few meetings ago.
Yes, we're anticipating we're going to have financial commitments there of about $37.5 million over the next 4 years or so.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Yes, I'd just like to, the statutory 5% reductions,
Yes.
what's that?
So this actually isn't necessarily a use of funds, but we do have to commit funds to this, which is basically we're required by law if we've got certain revenues like ad valorem revenues, we have to by law, when we look at what I believe the 100% mark is going to be on those, we have to reduce those by 5%. And we have to do that for various revenues, or all revenues within the budget. We're required statutorily to come up with our estimates and then reduce those to 95%.
Oh, I see, as a kind of reserve or protection.
Correct.
I see, I understand.
As a protection,
okay.
yes.
I was
Then we've got items that might be approved by the board mid-year that could have some financial effects going forward. We've got, as we go through the budget process, if commissioners have items that they would like to see funded, that's obviously something that those funds could be used for. We have staff compensation issues. We have our department budget requests. So we've received requests in from our departments. We've given them kind of some direction. As you'll see when we come to strategies for this coming year, we've kind of tried to hold things in check this year, so to speak, pending the vote on the homestead exemption. And then obviously if we've got new facilities that are coming online for projects that were in our capital program, a lot of those have some operating impacts, so we have to consider those. Some of the challenges, and Kevin will go over this, and when he's going over the pro forma and show you some projections, we've got our master plans that have recently been completed for fire rescue, We've got the courts to consider, parks and conservation. We know we've got some backlogs out there along with stormwater and affordable housing issues. Another challenge, obviously, as we've talked about, is the homestead exemption. Got the 10-year transportation plan, so we need to continue to increase the dollars every year that we're committing to transportation. So that will continue to be something that will, when we have future growth, we'll be committing some of that future growth to transportation. At an earlier board meeting this year, I had an agenda item that I brought to you, and I talked about the fact that our phosphate fund is starting to see some stress because the revenues, we receive revenues from the state once a year, and phosphate mining operations in Hillsborough County are starting to wind down, so those revenues are decreasing. We've got some funding commitments there, so that's something we'll have to address. I'll probably come back to you before the end of the year with an agenda item, and then we'll have to address it in the budget also. And then finally, one of the other challenges is maintaining pace with just growth in current services as the population grows. How do we continue to grow services to keep up?
Commissioner White has a question. You recognize?
And if I recall correctly, the main issue with that phosphate severance tax fund is some EPC activities, right, that we fund out of that?
We fund various things out of there. So, you know, as you know, Commissioner, this year we've committed $100,000 to the county fair.
Yep.
So we've periodically helped them out, but we have about $150,000 a year that we give to the port to monitor phosphate activity within Tampa Bay. Mm-hmm. We've got certain positions that are funded out of there because there's certain types of reviews that we do for projects that might have phosphate-related issues. So when you add it all up, we've got annual funding there, annual expenditures of about $1 million. And the revenue had been about $1 million a year. And this past year, it came in, I think it was around $700,000. And next month, we'll get the annual allocation. And I anticipate it'll be either that amount or less.
And I don't want to come across as having been around government so long that I sneeze at $1 million, but in the grand scheme of things, that's a relatively small fund, right?
As far as funds go, but again, if we've got, one of the things we need to look at what we are funding out of there and whether we need to continue to fund those things, because if we've got some ongoing obligations, then we might, but if we've got some things that are tied to the current operations and the operations are winding down, then maybe there are some things we can scale back. So it's something we just need to look at the expenditures and see if we can match those up as best we can with the revenues.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've seen this slide before. Just wanted to review again the proposed homestead exemption and what it means. It's an additional $25,000 exemption. It'll be voted on in November. It would affect the fiscal year 20 budget. It does require 60% voter approval. However, last time there was a homestead exemption on the ballot, it passed with 64% of the vote. It applies to values on a property between the $100,000 and $125,000 valuation level. So that's something that's a little bit different. And then based on, our current estimate of the revenue that we would lose would be about $30.6 million, which would be for both of our two general funds at about $28 million, and then roughly another $2 million out of our library district fund. And then it applies to all the taxing districts pretty much with the exception of the school district.
Commissioner Kipp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I know there's a graph later that shows the countywide and unincorporated, but again, the impact, do we have the impact broken down on revenue loss to the county from each of those funds? Countywide and
We do. I believe it's about 18, if I'm remembering correct, maybe about $18 million for the countywide, maybe 10 million or so from the unincorporated, and then a couple million for the library district.
Is the library district included in that 30.6 million?
It
okay.
is, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then we just wanted to give an example of what it would mean for an unincorporated area home with a value of $250,000. It would mean that basically their ad valorem, the county piece of their ad valorem would go down by about $269. Our recommended budget approach for this year, it is an off year of the budget, so we try to make fewer decisions in the off year, but we've got the homestead exemption coming up, so we've really asked our department to limit what they're asking for as far as expanded services. I think they've done a very good job with that. A lot of what I've seen so far is to help maintain current services, equipment replacement, technology replacements, and those types of things, or things related to emergency management. So those are most of what I've received so far as budget submissions from our departments. I focus on maintaining our infrastructure, continue to fund our transportation plan. We've already had a workshop with you regarding water rates and the water department operations. So we are feeling some pressure in both the water and solid waste systems. And then we always take a look at researching some potential user fee opportunities. And then finally, one of the things that's become more of an issue in recent years for us is our employee health care costs. So we are looking at some strategies there, and we're reviewing those right now.
Do most county governments give full family coverage, including spouse? Do you know? I mean, I'm see what I think. What my question really is sometimes one spouse's coverage may be better under the other spouse's coverage rather than the coverage they have in their own workplace, and I think, we should try to eliminate that unless we already, have that in place.
No, we don't. Just yesterday we went through some proposals, and that was one area where there are other places that do differentiate. We do not. So currently, if a spouse is working elsewhere and they can get insurance, health insurance from their employer, we don't require that. That may be something we want to consider. So once we get this analysis and options in shape, we'll bring it to you at either a workshop or a board meeting. But we do have I think some really good ideas about how to use tools like that to reduce our cost and get better outcomes for everyone.
Okay, Commissioner Miller, you're recognized.
Thank you. Even if that happens, that a situation occurs, our employees, don't they pay part of their medical plans?
Yes, they do, yeah.
So it's really up to the employee to say if their wife or husband has an insurance someplace else and then they want to have it here, they're still paying for it. I know we pay a portion of it, but they're still paying for it. Am I correct?
Yeah, and that's really where it gets to be a decision point, because what we saw yesterday is that the difference between premiums and coverage for an individual versus a family is that for the family coverage, the premium is really not high enough to cover the cost of claims. So yes, the answer is yes, someone who has a family, a spouse and children, does pay a premium, a family premium. But that family premium is not enough to cover the cost of claims that are generated by a family. Whereas an employee, a single person, their premium is coming closer to paying for claims on a total basis, on an entire population basis. So that's going to be one area where we're going to have to make some decisions. And they're not easy decisions.
My concern is this, and what Commissioner Murray just said, and what you said concerning the family plan not really not covering a lot of the issues or a lot of medical concerns that a family has.
Right.
And I understand we may have to look at increasing the cost of a family plan. I don't want to see where we have employees that because we jacked the price up of their contribution to family plan just covers himself and the family's not covered someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
Follow me?
Yeah.
Now, there might be a situation where the employee covers himself, the spouse's insurance plan someplace else may be cheaper to cover the rest of the family.
Right.
That's a good go. That's okay.
Right.
But to then say, you know, we're going to jack the price up 50% on the family plan, and that person says, I can't afford to do that. They're working on a park somewhere. They can't afford to do that. Then they say, okay, I'll just cover myself, and the rest of the family,
Yeah.
on your own. That is not good, to me, public policy, and it's not good it's going to end up having some real morale problems with our employees.
Yeah, and we would never propose that. So we're looking at other ways to incentivize better choices. So you don't always have to go to an emergency room. You can go to a, what are they called? Urgent care. And so, if employees are listening, there is no proposal on the table to increase family premiums. This is just a discussion about, at this point, where we are.
They're listening, but you're going to get some emails.
Yeah. But so here's the other interesting thing. So just yesterday or this week, for the first time, we've been wanting to do this for a long time, every employee got at their personal mail at home a statement of all the benefits and salary that they get. And the response that I'm hearing was actually overwhelmingly thank you and positive. It opens up everyone's eyes as to really the value of the non-wage benefits that they get. But to your point, we, as part of our wellness program and encouraging behavioral choices, we want everyone to have coverage, but we want them to have coverage and we want them to have programs that incentivize them to do prevention and to look for lower cost services in lieu of having to raise premiums. So that's really where we're headed here. But we'll bring that back as a separate item.
And as far as service, I know you're going to limit service expansions, but for the current services we have across the board, I mean, are we looking at, say, are we thinking new ways to partner with maybe providers in the community to help, reduce some administration expenses, those type of things?
Yes. So those won't be ready for this year's budget. They'll be ready for the two-year budget.
Two-year.
Those are the 5 initiatives that we're working on with the CAC, the Citizens Advisory Committee. And out of that will come some recommendations for different ways to provide service where we don't have to do it. We can partner with other folks in the community, incentivizing people to become more self-sufficient and less reliant on just entitlement programs, but doing it in a way that helps them get education, job training, so forth. So I think there'll be a lot of really good suggestions that help us maybe not eliminate service, but change the face of service, change the efficiency and effectiveness of it. But that really won't be ready until probably beginning of next year. So.
Okay. I just to add one more thing, I'd like to really see us serve more people without, not necessarily expanding, the scope of the services, but possibly looking at the service delivery and how we can accomplish that. Because I think that's what people expect from us is, everybody wants some kind of level of service in the community. So we need to do the very best job we can to make sure as many people get service as possible.
Yes, that's part of it as well.
Good. Thank you. Okay.
And Commissioners, the final slide I had in this part of the presentation is just to just give you a sense of the budget workshops potential workshops that we have on the calendar. So we have quite a few on here. We don't anticipate needing all of these. However, we wanted to make sure that the dates were available in case there were some things that either came up or some things that you wanted to workshop. We do have the dates available. And then we have 2 public hearings that are currently on the calendar, one in June, one in July, that are optional for us or discretionary, and then the 2 mandatory ones where we actually go through the budget adoption process in September.
Okay. Commissioner White, you're recognized.
Thank you. I think this question's most appropriate for this portion of the presentation. Mr. Merrill, do we levy the public service tax?
No, we do not.
Okay. At just a high level, and I know I'm kind of catching you off guard here, what would you think of a potential tax swap? And I want to stress to my colleagues one more time, tax swap, not a tax hike, whereby we were to levy that tax and maybe reduce ad valorem taxes by an offsetting amount.
What's been the trend in public service tax growth? Has it been, or do we know?
No, I imagine with the
We don't really
growth,
know
it's,
for ourselves.
Yeah. I think, so the decision, I think, would be based on looking at where we expect those revenues to go. So that if we swapped and the public service tax growth fell below the growth in property tax, that would put us further behind the curve. But it may be the other way around. I just don't know, but we'll have to look at that. So I think that would be the determination.
Can you give the board at a future workshop just a real high-level look at that concept?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, and it would apply to the unincorporated area. So it wouldn't necessarily be a countywide
County.
thing. It would be
and
something.
that's,
Okay.
you're talking what I call the telecommunications?
No, this is on electric, gas, those kinds of utilities. What's the other one? Gas and
That was
electric,
one of
yeah.
the potential, though, options we considered for transportation. I
Yeah,
know a
right.
while back. That's why
That's the
not
one.
sure. I didn't know if it was telecommunications, but I remember it was some kind of a utility tax. Because I remember talking to Tico, and, you know, they're kind of neutral on it.
Yeah,
In a lot of ways. And of course, the city does levy it, and they get 30 million, about 30 million from theirs.
And that-
So,
And that would be a big policy decision, but I think it at least deserves a high-level look, even in a workshop setting.
Yeah.
Even if it's only in a workshop setting.
right.
yes.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Miller.
Let me ask
you're
a question. Why would we consider that? Commissioner White?
For the very reason that Mr. Merrill mentioned, you know, you could have different projected growth rates in the two, and I don't think we really know the answer to that question right now, but, you know, I think it's worth a look. So, based upon projections, future projections.
Diversifying our revenues would also be another reason, but not knowing how strong that revenue is would be the thing we'd have to come back with. So there are a lot of cities and counties across Florida that do levy other type, like the public service tax and others, in addition to the ones that we levy. And so it gives them a more diverse revenue portfolio, which tends to cushion things when one is not growing as much as the other, but
It's a good point as well.
Let me ask another question, and maybe Commissioner Chris, who was with me in the legislature, could help me with this. Maybe I'm missing something. But does not the state basically dictate what percentage a local government can get on those taxes?
there's a limitation, yeah.
we-
There's a cap.
The cap is 10%.
That's what I thought.
Okay, Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Thank you. You were saying 2%?
No, I'm
Commissioner
I'm just asking about the idea of a tax swap where we would levy some or all of the public service tax, but then offset that with a reduction in ad valorem. And to Mr. Merrill's point, that could potentially diversify our revenues, and also, you know, it could lead to a different potential pathway with respect to future growth in revenues. But that's where we would need to see an analysis from staff to have a better idea of what that would mean.
Because I know it's been suggested here before 2%, and I know that there's, as you stated, a cap of 10%. The city's up to the full cap, but I remember from your last presentation last year that you had said that Palm Beach County, which is similar in size, I think you said Palm Beach, similar in size to us, just a little bit bigger, they levy the full 10%, and if I remember correctly, I thought it brought in $80 million a year. It was pretty substantial, but that was the full levy. Just
That's probably about right. Yep.
Okay.
All right, I guess at this point, I'll turn it over to Kevin, who'll go over the 5-year pro forma.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Kevin Bricky with Management and Budget. And we're going to take a look at what the budget looks like in the two general funds and how it might unfold given what we currently know over 5 years. And as Mr. Merrill said, we're also going to look at how the general fund budgets would look with impacts from the third homestead exemption, which we think is likely to pass, and how the addition of including the identified master plans and other identified needs that are as yet unfunded, how those would look if they were placed into the budget beginning in FY20. The pro forma is built this year with a backdrop of an economy that's still doing quite well. Unemployment rates are low, job growth is high, wages have started to grow again. Certainly equity markets are a little volatile. But in generally speaking, with strong growth. The current economic expansion is now this month 106 months old, which is now the second longest since World War II. The longest was 110 months. So it is a long expansion. The other parameter, and that'll also show in the next slide, is that home prices are doing quite well and growing strongly. And so taxable property values we expect to continue to show strong growth. And that's very important for the general funds because that's about 70% of revenue that comes into the general funds. For FY19, we're expecting growth to be about 8.4%, which is a little bit slower than FY18. FY18 was about 8.8%. For the outer years, the 4 outer years, FY20 to 23, we've modeled the 20-year average annual growth rate of 5.55%, which is also remaining fairly strong. We'll also include the third homestead exemption. As Tom mentioned, between the two funds, that's about $28 million, $10 million countywide, and 18 million countywide and about 10 million unincorporated. On the expenditure side, most non-personnel expenditure costs are modeled to rise at the combined rate of population and government inflation. That's about 5.1%. And then looking back at our last 20 years of experience, that tracks very well. It's about 5%. Personnel wage costs modeled to rise about 33%. The transportation plan is included in the pro forma as you have adopted. So those costs are modeled here. And the pro forma will also layer in some of the slides the master plans and other potential needs that we've indicated, mainly parks, conservation, fire rescue, stormwater, affordable housing. As I said, home sales and prices did very well in 2017. That will set our ad valorem for FY19. Prices rose somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 9.7%, depending on the different measures of home prices, but nonetheless, whichever one you use, it remained strong. So here's the first slide for the pro forma. And this one is looking at where we are given our current known expenditures and where we think they're going forward and our revenues. But this is without an impact from a third homestead exemption and without master plans. So this slide shows that on our current state, the countywide fund has about $100 million surplus in the outer years. The countywide fund is doing relatively well. The unincorporated fund has a deficit, $28 million, and that's where we've been talking to you in the past couple of years, is that the unincorporated fund has the pressure. And that's where we see growing service needs and some deficiencies that perhaps need to be met. And as population grows, it puts more pressure on that fund. If we layer in the proposed homestead exemption, so that starts in FY20. And here, as you would expect, it decreases the surpluses in the outer years for the countywide fund by about $70 million, and it increases the deficits in the unincorporated fund. So indeed, the homestead exemption does have a negative impact on our ability to maintain.
Can I just ask a question about this? Because, unincorporated has all the growth. Well, there is some growth in the city, too, of Tampa, but I think, looking towards the future, the population growth is going to be more in the unincorporated area. So how do we get ourselves in balance with countywide?
Well, that's some of the slides that we're going to look at. We're going to look at some possibilities or some scenarios that might show us the impacts of taking some actions. The unincorporated fund is likely to experience faster ad valorem growth, and we have modeled that slightly faster growth rate in here.
Should have well, of course, what you should have done is always the case, but would it have been better for them to allocate or have a determined allocation of a certain percentage of your unincorporated revenues to accommodate the growth? Because it's obviously the demand in services is what's causing the deficit.
And that's I think the issue that this is pointing out, and that as we go through some scenarios, we'll drive that home.
Because it needs to get corrected.
Yes.
We can't just keep digging the hole deeper.
And I think that is the implication of these slides, yes.
Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I think that's total evidence, and this says no master plans, right, included in this. So, this speaks to the fact that growth does not pay for itself, and that as we keep throwing new growth beyond the urban service area, I'm just saying, we are losing every time. It is not helping us. It is hurting our quality of life and our budget, and taxpayers are paying more for that. It doesn't pay for itself. It takes away. But the reason our unincorporated is 4.3% millage, our countywide is 5.7% millage. So there's a huge difference in the millage between the two funds. But can we be clear about this, that the countywide fund is set for certain services that are defined, and you cannot mix that with the services that are particular to the unincorporated. So it's not as if you can, I guess you'll show us some other things, but I can't imagine the magic things that we can do except look at the tax revenue or cut what unincorporated county is the master plans.
Commissioner, you're correct that the two general funds fund specific items. Countywide services are in the countywide fund. That law enforcement for the sheriff, animal services, pet resources are in the countywide fund. A lot of the services in the unincorporated are what, if you were in a city would provide. Fire rescue type services are in there. Social services are in the countywide fund. So yes, but yeah, as we go through, we're going to look at some other possibilities.
I mean, because the social services, that's always, not that I don't want to provide services to everybody in the county, but that is an agreement that was made way back that we would do the social services for everybody in the county. I mean, the city does not do any social services.
But that comes out of the countywide fund
Right.
exclusively, so that would not affect the unincorporated
Well,
fund.
that's on the unincorporated, yes, you're right.
Yeah, so that is the distinction between the services and why, even if you were to not agree to do that, it doesn't
Stuck.
touch this problem.
Right.
I would just want to qualify this issue of growth paying for itself. It depends on the kind of growth, and it depends where the growth is. So, for example, homes over a certain value, and we haven't actually empirically defined that, but it's probably around 300,000, 250,000. Homes in value above that amount do tend to pay for the services that they get as a generalization. Clearly, commercial, industrial do pay probably more and offset the loss in revenue from lower valued homes. So distinguishing between the type of growth, but also, you know, where the growth goes, and this is kind of that whole discussion on land use and population projections. So if you configure growth in a certain place and you configure it in a certain way, it could potentially pay for itself. The problem is when it starts expanding and reaching out, and it just takes more effort and time and cost to provide services. It's a very complicated issue, but I just wanted to be sure that we distinguished between the shades of gray.
Point appreciated, and it's exactly what I've been
Yeah.
saying. Where there's infrastructure in place, if you put down whatever value it is that you say that you have for this house, and you put it down in a place where there's infrastructure and you don't have, but if we start putting all this new growth in places where there's not infrastructure, it's costly growth. The same house put in two different places, depending on where it lands, could cost us a lot.
Exactly.
Or not cost us much at all, or be beneficial.
Oh, I don't think it should cost us anything. And I told Lucia there should be a premium cost. Like almost if you did like zones, you figured out where all the infrastructure was. You go outside one zone, you get into another, there's a different cost structure for any kind of infrastructure costs like roads and utilities. And I think I think we should have been thinking that way for a long time, because the further out, they should have been paying maybe a premium price for the costs of what, the utilities, the roads, everything, sidewalks, everything that goes into that development.
And we're not only talking, though, about impacts like mobility fees or that, we're talking about operations, which I've said before.
Yeah, no, I agree.
When we're thinking, I really think on our land use that we keep doing, there should be, a page, the front one, in big letters that talk about what our costs are and what our future operating costs. I'm quite serious.
If you want to locate here, here's what your costs are going to be.
Not to the person, but to us when we're looking at development and when we're thinking about putting things outside the urban service area and how it's going to impact us and the cost of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let's look at one hypothetical way that the unincorporated deficit shown on slide 5 might be dealt with, and that would be through spending cuts in the unincorporated fund. In this case, what's modeled is an $11.4 million cut in FY20, which would represent about 5% of the county administrator budget currently. If fire rescue were included, it would be a 16 or nearly 17% cut of the county administrator's budget outside of fire rescue. If the cut applied to all agencies, elected officials, it would be about 2.6%. That would be a recurring $11 million cut. And then in FY21, to continue to turn the unincorporated fund balanced, it would require an additional $7 million cut in FY21. And I've provided those percentages again. If the total cut to the county administrator budget between the two would be about 8%. If it were without fire rescue, it would be about 27%. That's a hypothetical way to deal with it, a possible way to deal with it. But, of course, as we cut and we make those cuts, 70 to 80% of our departmental budgets are people, and so that tends to mean people, jobs. And if we layered in, after looking at that possibility with cuts, if we put in the master plans and other identified needs, then we're in a large deficit situation when we add in those master plan costs and the identified needs. Were about $282 million negative in the unincorporated fund.
And you're excluding stormwater and affordable housing from this. Is that right? Is that what it says? So we're including in this the impact of conservation and environmental lands, fire rescue, parks and recreation, but not stormwater and affordable housing? There's a note at the bottom there on the left.
That I'm afraid is incorrect. Stormwater and affordable housing is included.
It's included.
Say, if
Okay.
it
Yeah, I
was
think
excluded, we'd really be in
something
bad shape.
got pasted in there
Okay.
incorrectly. So that's including
And how much are we including for affordable housing?
$10 million a year.
So that's the trust fund that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So the one thing, so this slide assumes that we funded all of these all of these master plans and needs at 100% of what we believe the cost is. It also assumes that we would pay for them on a pay-as-you-go basis. So another way to look at this would be if we were, for example, to take parks and recreation and fire rescue and hypothetically have asked voters whether they would be willing to do a voter-approved referendum for specific millage to pay for parks, for debt service on parks and fire rescue. That would then relieve some of this cost because voters would be saying, yes, we want to tax ourselves on top of current millage to pay for parks. And you look back over 30 years, voters have consistently approved 3 types of voter referendums for services: public safety, parks, and conservation, ELAP. Those have all been successful every time they've gone to voters. So that would be a way to relieve some of this as another way to address it. But I did want to, that did look a little bit unusual.
Yeah,
I wanted
that,
to just-
the note there,
Okay.
I've copied a couple of words incorrectly, but we will come to those other scenarios.
Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Thank you. On the last graph, I'm confused again, because as I see it, it was only the deficits are only in the unincorporated, correct?
Yes.
You're back to there, yes. And so, but there was where is the language that was on there? Didn't you have about the, you had the funds listed at you had the ELAB.
I think you want to go back a couple slides, Kevin. Back to 7. There you go. That
Thank
one.
you.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's, again, I'm confused between the unincorporated and countywide. So Countywide has the conservation, has the ELAP, correct?
In this, the Conservation Environmental Lands Management Master Plan costs are in the countywide fund. They're about, for that period, $19.5 million. All of the rest, $294 million, is in the unincorporated fund.
So I have two questions, and one would be, if we're running surpluses, as we have been continually, in the countywide fund, and the ELAP is in the countywide fund, why would we cut that?
The cuts in this slide are only to the unincorporated.
Right, but the ELAP, am I confused here? The ELAP is not part of the unincorporated fund, correct?
The ELAP acquisition is in a different fund, yes. So
And it's
these
part
are,
of the
these are
unincorporated?
operating costs, I believe, for conservation.
My other question would be this: fire, rescue, parks, and recreation. And when you talk about a voter-approved referendum, so that a referendum would be only in unincorporated?
Yes, yes, that's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So let's go
Well,
back
ma'am,
to
Madam
slide
Chair.
5.
Yes, Commissioner Miller. you
Let's go back to
recognize.
slide 7.
Okay.
Did I hear right that we're going to have $10 million in a affordable housing trust fund?
This assumes that,
Well, you know what assuming does, don't you?
right.
The first three letters.
But it's a way to show the impact.
Why don't we just say it's recurring, might be recurring costs
Yeah.
for affordable housing?
This isn't modeled as a
Not
trust
trust
fund or
fund.
not as a trust fund. It is modeled as $10 million
Okay.
of
Just wanna make
unincorporated
it perfectly
dollars
clear.
going to
Right.
affordable housing.
Just wanna
In
make it
recurring
perfectly clear.
costs.
In recurring
Yes.
costs, okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
So let's go back.
Commissioner Kemp?
Thank you.
recognize.
Sorry, but so when you say $10 million in recurring costs, but what we saw yesterday was that there's absolutely that we contribute from the countywide or the general funds, basically nothing to affordable housing now. It's all the federal and state, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say $1.5 to $2 million is nothing, because that's what we're
Is that-
contributing
It-
now.
It's minimal, but what Kevin's suggesting here is $10 million to come from
To come from-
unincorporated area that he's layered into this model for your analysis.
I was just trying to get a correct read on the, from the dollars yesterday, what I heard, 6 to 800,000. So when I started hearing 10 million,
This is an additional.
okay, thanks.
And that could be from different sources, too. That money could be counted
Right. Kevin's
not as direct revenue, but there may be like match dollars, there might be different things attached to it, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
And for illustration purposes, he's just saying if we needed an extra $10 million to come from the unincorporated area, this would then be part of the impact.
Okay. Commissioner Miller, did you have a question? No. Oh, okay. Okay.
Slide 8 backs us up to where we were at slide 5, with the homestead exemption modeled in, but no master plans or other needs. Looking at another way to reduce deficits in the unincorporated fund. One possible way is to a millage swap. What is a millage swap? Reducing countywide millage by, say, 1 mil and increasing unincorporated millage by, say, 1 mil. The effect of that would be no change in property tax for an unincorporated landowner, homeowner. So in this case, there is room for about a 0.075 millage swap without causing the countywide fund to not be in balance any longer. So that does reduce the unincorporated deficit in the outer years from 70 million to about 53 million, But that's about the extent of the availability for that swap without making the countywide fund to be in a long-term deficit or having to take other decisions regarding the countywide fund.
So just, I mean, I know this is stating the obvious, but it's probably worth noting. So with a millage swap, although the unincorporated resident sees no increase because their unincorporated residents pay a countywide and an unincorporated millage. And one is going down, one is going up by the same amount, so it's a zero impact. However, in the cities, a city resident actually sees a reduction in their tax bill because they're paying a city millage, but their countywide millage is going down. So then that opens up the opportunity for the city of Tampa, city of Plant City, and Temple Terrace to actually increase their city millage to get everyone back up to where they were to provide funding for things that they may need, for transit, for transportation. So it actually works to the advantage of the city. It's neutral in the unincorporated area, if you see what I mean.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's a flip side to it that it may be interesting or appealing. I don't know. It's a little bit hard to explain, but
I get it.
yeah.
In this case, a 0.075 millage swap, our countywide revenue would go down by about $7 million. Our unincorporated revenue would go up by about $4 million. So we would have a net reduction between the two funds of close to $3 million. Getting to what Mike was saying was that this then would be a reduction in millage in the incorporated areas.
Can I just ask right here too, because I forgot to ask it when Commissioner White brought it up, but if we were to do a gas tax, could that be included if you're bringing back the public utilities tax or whatever they call it, and include that, and maybe that's a swap too of some sort? But then that fluctuates. So I guess you'd have to look at like a 10-year period to see how does it fluctuate so you understand what the bottom is and what the top is.
Yes.
Because I'd love to have it on the ballot in 18. Why not? There's 13 crazy constitutional amendments. Okay, Commissioner Kemp. You're
Thanks.
recognized.
For clarification, it doesn't need to be on the ballot, correct?
Gas tax?
Uh-huh.
No, it does not.
Right,
Well,
just five
five
of us
people.
approve
Five
it.
of us
Yeah,
need
so,
it.
yeah. And the other, I just want to say, again, it would be a diversification, but by all predictions, we're going very electric. So it's going to be a diversification and a fund that is dropping, but pretty soon we won't be able to take it. So I think we should be getting it while we can.
And if we instituted a public service tax, we'd pick it up on the other side. So
Right.
That's one way to kind of hedge the bet.
Well, one thing you have to remember, you have to do the gas tax before, what is it, October 1st? To collect it for the next, to start collecting it the next year.
It may be July 1st, but
So if every year we wait, it's going to be another almost 12 months before we can start to see the money. That's the issue. That, I don't see why we should have done that a couple of years ago.
okay, slide 10 takes us back to our state in slide 5, where we have the homestead exemption, but no master plans. And in this slide, we don't have the cuts that we showed hypothetically in the unincorporated fund, and we don't have a millage swap. So we're back to that state. And then slide 12 adds in the full master plans for conservation, environmental lands, fire rescue, parks and rec, and stormwater and affordable housing. And it reduces the surplus in the countywide fund and it increases the deficit in the outer year to about $350 million.
So with additional sources that we've been talking with you about, will you be able to show us how it affects that bottom line, like the public services, tax, some of these other things?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay.
This slide takes the previous slide and just shows where those deficits come in. And we separate out the master plans on what is capital and what is operating. Capital over that period of time is about $200 million, and the operating piece gets larger in the outer years as new facilities come online, particularly fire stations. And the balance of those deficits were the deficits that we already have without the master plans. Here's 50%. What if we just did half of the master plans in these 4 years? It certainly reduces the deficits, but they're still there. Still there. Slide 14 is getting towards...
These don't include a referendum.
No, this
Slide
one,
14 would.
does.
14 would. This is
It
getting
would.
towards what Mr. Merrill
Okay.
was speaking about earlier, was what if we took, in this case, it's the first 4 years of capital costs for fire rescue and parks, and a voted bond were to pass, it would be $77 million, about a $5 million annual debt service. And in this case, stormwater and affordable housing are excluded from this graph. This is just looking at if we did the fire rescue and parks and rec on the unincorporated side. It does indeed reduce those deficits to 92.7. And then the next slide is what if we were to have voted operating millage for the impacts of the parks and the fire rescue plans. And in here, we have an additional 0.15 mils in FY 21 and 22. That's about $9.2 million. And then in FY 23, another 0.7 or so mils to a total of 0.325 mils. That's $22 million. So it does mitigate those deficits. We're down to about $54 million. That takes us back to where we were perhaps without the master plans. But again, stormwater and affordable housing are excluded in this, and the stormwater and affordable housing are $36 million annually. So that if we were to add that in, that deficit would be closer to $100 million.
And this is assuming that the additional stormwater costs are paid from the general fund rather than from an increase in the stormwater fee. So another option would be to increase the stormwater fee, which would then relieve some of these deficits as well.
Right.
And of course, this doesn't include any budget cuts.
Correct.
Right. So, but I think the interesting thing about this slide is that although there's still a deficit, it's in a more manageable kind of range, so that even just timing expenditures differently, stretching them out a little bit, maybe doing an across-the-board budget cut where everybody is part of it, not just my departments. It just is a little bit the other slides you look at them and you go, holy cow, that's you can't even overcome it. Now this starts to bring us into a range where there's some techniques that we could use to kind of mitigate some of this stuff. So that's why I think it's important. And we're asking voters, do you want more parks programs? Do you want more fire rescue? we're not just doing it. And as I said, those are the ones that voters have consistently approved time and time again over 30 years, just like ELAP. So it doesn't guarantee that they would approve it again, but it's just perspective. So.
Okay, thank you.
So in summary, we were trying to show different scenarios, possibilities. There are policy decisions, and most of them still showed that the pressure is in the unincorporated fund. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good presentation.
I guess we're done, right? What? Oh, reserves, yeah. We just have reserves. Tom, you want to do that one?
Yes, Commissioners, one thing we wanted to go over again, reserves make up $1.2 billion out of our $5 billion budget. And from time to time, we do have individuals who ask questions about reserves and believe that we can use reserves to solve some of our problems. And the point I wanted to make is that, again, it's like a bank account. So unless those reserves are replaced with a recurring source, they're generally one-time funds. And they're there in a lot of cases for specific reasons, and there are restrictions on a lot of those reserves also. So today what I wanted to do is just run through that, see if you had any questions related to reserves, and identify some areas where you've got some restrictions and some other areas where there might be a little bit more flexibility. One of the slices of the pie, I'll go back real quick. So
Commissioner Kemp has a question.
I thought you were going to go over this first. On this slide here, you might guess what I'm going to ask. The general fund is, again, countywide and unincorporated reserves combined.
That's
And
correct.
Can you break that out?
Off the top of my head, Kevin can take a look in the document, our budget document, and in a couple minutes give you an idea of how much those are in each area. But we'll, what I'll do is on the slides I'm going through, we'll have that information in just a second. You can see on the first slide here, we're pretty equally balanced in a lot of areas. We've got reserves in solid waste, water, our internal service funds, which those would be our, health insurance fund, that would be our fleet fund. We'll go through some of that on the future slides. Each of these, I'm going to break each of these out in different slices. So on a countywide basis, we are at about $172 million out of the 244, and the unincorporated is about $72 million.
And at some point in the future, I'd really like to see how that matches up to the funds, to the needs itself.
Sure, and I do have a slide and just a couple of slides that'll kind of show the balance percentage-wise between the two, as far as when I say percentage-wise, percentage of the expenditures in each of those funds. So when we're targeting the 20% level, I do have percentages of what each of those funds makes up. On your general fund reserves, we've got contingency reserves. Those are reserves that are there to be used or available, not say used, but available for anything that may come up during the year where there's a need that's identified that wasn't anticipated at the beginning of the year. That's $97 million. We've got BP oil spill reserves, $22.8 million. So those are obviously funds that were received several years ago. When we're doing, and when I'm doing calculations, as you can see on this slide here, I'm calculating a reserve percentage for our general funds at 21.26%, and I'm excluding the BP reserves because we are anticipating that those will be purposed or used by the board at some point within the upcoming future. So we don't even really count those as reserves when we're calculating our reserves for purposes of meeting our policy reserves and for purposes of what we present to rating agencies. We do have the new board policy that the board adopted a couple of years ago related to fund balance and reserves, where we target reserve balances between 20 to 25%, so we are within that range. We have some reserves that we set aside for what we call unrealized fund balance and stabilization. Again, those are for unanticipated shortfalls in revenue or unanticipated expenditures above where we thought that they might be. those are just basically, this goes back to what Mike was saying earlier. These are kind of designated. They're not necessarily restricted. So they are available for use if there ever were to be a need. And then we have up in the other slice up here, we've got other designated reserves. Again, not restricted. These are board designated reserves or funds that are set aside for things such as grant matches. So if we go out and there's grants that we're applying for and we need matching dollars, we can come to these reserves. You see attrition there. So that's one where that's for our personnel budget. So in any organization, when we've got our positions established, we've got a certain number of positions, we never have all of our positions filled. So when we're budgeting when we budget the full cost of all the positions. So if we budget the full cost of all the positions, knowing that we're going to have vacancies throughout the year, then we're setting aside basically dollars that we know we're not going to spend. So there's some factor, and there's a board policy that sets up an attrition reserve there that basically just pulls some of those funds out. And then finally, we've got economic development reserves. $14 million. The important thing there to realize is that we do have about $8 or $9 million of future commitments that we have in the economic development area. And so when you kind of realize that you've got $14 million in reserves, close to $15 million in reserves, but you do have about $8 or $9 million in future commitments out there. And this is the slide where we show our general fund reserve analysis just over time. You can see that when we hit that 20% mark, that shortly after that, we did receive our AAA bond rating from both Fitch and Moody's back in 2010 area. And then, again, we've got kind of the bar there that shows a 20% level. We had grown reserves up through fiscal year 13. We've drawn them down through fiscal year 17. And then this past year, we have increased reserves a little bit in anticipation of the homestead exemption. So we're planning for it. We really held the cap on things in fiscal year 18 as far as our expenditures, getting ready for what we might be seeing in fiscal year 20. The other thing that I wanted to point out here, going back to the countywide and the unincorporated area, is that we've got a 24% reserve level in the countywide fund, but only 17% in the unincorporated area. So in order to get to that 21.26% level, we basically had to rely more on the countywide reserves than an unincorporated area. Solid waste reserves, it's fairly self-explanatory. We've got rate stabilization reserves, we've got landfill closure, capital reserves, operating and some debt service. So the landfill closure, you've got laws that are out there, state laws, you've got governmental accounting principles that basically dictate that we have certain dollars set aside for future costs associated with monitoring and closing landfills. So that's why some of those reserves are there. There's footnotes in our CAFR, our annual financial statements, that identify and kind of identify what those reserves are. A lot of the reserves in the solid waste and water fund are driven by our bond covenants. So we've got what we call flow of funds for our revenues, and those bond documents basically prescribe where dollars go. And so a lot of the reserve levels that we have here are driven by those bond covenants.
Commissioner Kemp has a question. You're recognized.
Thank you. I just was looking and a little fascinated by the general fund reserve analysis that went from 07 to 18. So was there a policy put in 10 about the 20%? I mean, I just think it's amazing during this time of up to 07 when we were having such growth and that we had only 14% or 13%. That's an amazing change.
It is, yes.
And was that due to policy of, the board, or was that?
It's really, I don't know. There wasn't a specific policy that I'm recalling.
But we moved in that direction.
We did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to comment.
Yeah, we were coming out of the recession, and that at that point still didn't have the kind of revenue to prop up reserves, and But yeah, it was a conscious decision of the board, and it paid off in the long run because we did get our AAA ratings, and that means a lot. And so we kind of got it back on track. But you know, a lot of cities and counties didn't make that decision, and they're really paying for it now. They just kept eating away at their bank account, at their reserves, and thinking the recession was going to be over, and they got caught. Huh? Yeah.
Less than 50.
Commissioner
Less than
Higginbotham,
50,
you
yeah.
recognize.
Yeah, and it was I don't know that we can put it on a particular policy, but there were a lot of late nights with staff, and Bonnie and her crew and Tom and everyone working in that direction. And it was a painful time, but it did pay off in the long run. And I know the objective was that AAA bond rating. And last time I looked, it was less than 50 in the country that enjoy that bond rating. And that saves millions. I don't know what the savings is now, but it's millions of dollars every year because of that.
Less than 50 out of, I think it's over 3,000 counties.
Yes, thank you, out of 3,000 counties.
Right.
You remember those times, Bonnie?
Then we've got our water system reserves, similar to solid waste. A lot of it's driven by the bond covenants. A couple things that are a little bit different here is we do have water impact fees. So you've got some reserves related to water impact fees, and then you've got the assessment units out there, which are basically allowing certain areas to basically pay for expansion of the system over time. Special revenue funds. This goes back to a lot of those funds that earlier I was telling you about that were restricted. We've got reserve. We've got over 50 special revenue funds. Some of them are very small, up to the ones that are much larger. So, on this particular slide, you can see, for instance, in the Indigent Healthcare Fund, we've got about $76 million in reserves. The annual budget for the Indigent Healthcare Fund is something over $100 million. You did take a board action back on March 7th to expand eligibility from 110% of the federal poverty level up to 125%. So we do anticipate, and we had a consultant we worked with a consultant, but we do anticipate that we will start to draw those reserves down a little bit over the upcoming years, but not to levels that are unacceptable, just to a lower level. We've got school site impact fees. So that's where we collect impact fees, and then as the school system and the school districts makes requests of us, we distribute those fees to them. So the balances there are really driven by the timing of the needs from the school district. We've got a number of different law enforcement and court type special revenue funds. So you've got Florida laws, you've got federal laws that dictate how certain revenues will be expended. And so you can see I've got a list here of the different funds here. A lot of those are basically under the control of the sheriff's office. Some of them are under our control. Some of them are under our control with advice from the sheriff's office. So again, those funds are very restricted for very particular purposes. And then finally, we've got a slice of the pie that's about $13 million that represents about 20 different various funds with reserve balances of about $13 million.
Commissioner Kemp, you're recognized.
Thank you. I have a question about, if we go back to the school site impact fees. So and I didn't catch quite the full numbers on it. So is that what is the reserve like compared to the fund or need in this case? Is this?
As far as the need, or I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Yeah, when you gave the annual budget of the healthcare, indigent healthcare, and that we can bring up the funding for the level of poverty. Is there, in terms of the school site impact fees, do we have a good reserve there? Is there any availability?
Yeah, I think as it relates to those, we're kind of we basically distribute those fees as the school board requests them. So we really don't have much insight into what the timing of what their needs are. They know the funds are there, and when they do have a need and they want to access those funds, they contact us and they're distributed. So
The reason I was asking was because there's been several times here questions about school safety issues, sidewalks around schools and that, but I'm supposing that this isn't available for that or couldn't be?
That's correct, yeah. The ordinance, I believe, or agreement, does not allow these to be used for off-site transportation solutions, only for on-site, on the school site.
Is that agreement an interlocal agreement that we have, or is that dictated by something, or?
I'm not sure whether it's in the ordinance or whether it's an interlocal agreement. We'll have to check on that, one or the other.
Thank you.
And they would be restricted for, they'd have to meet the requirements of impact fees also, which
Yeah.
expansion.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Right.
School expansion, yeah.
Then we've got sales tax fund reserves. So the biggest slice of the pie here is our half-cent sales tax reserve, or half-cent sales tax reserves. It's about $29 million in fiscal year 18. Those balances have fluctuated over the years anywhere between about $20 million up to as high as maybe 45. Those are flexible funds. They are available, and they can be used for general revenue type purposes. We carry that balance. It's in a kind of an additional safeguard for us, or an additional place we can go if during the year we have, for instance, an economic development opportunity that may pop up. A recent example would be the estuary. I think we needed roughly $6 million in one particular year, and this was the place we went to get those funds. And then the other three slices of the pie there are tourist development tax. And so with our 5th-cent tourist development tax, we basically have committed that to Amalie Arena. We've got some pretty extensive future commitments out there to Amalie Arena. And so that piece is basically restricted for that purpose. We use the 4th-cent tourist development tax for Raymond James, for Steinbrenner Field, Tampa Convention Center, and we do have some future commitments out there for that also. And then you've got the 3-cent piece, which, as you can see, needs to be used for capital construction of tourist-related facilities, tourist promotion, or beach and shoreline maintenance. We've got our transportation trust fund reserves, so we've got some capital reserves out there of about $12 million. One of the larger projects we've got some reserves on is US 301 road widening. We've got our mobility fees, impact fees, and then you've got the street lighting districts that have some reserves.
Are the mobility fees indexed? I know we talked about it one time.
I don't know, I'll have to,
Like
check on that.
stormwater? Like we're talking about for stormwater?
I think they are, but I'll have someone check on it for
I
you.
think, yeah. I think the indexing on that would be prudent, given, you know, the cost of construction is going up. I mean, it's like everything's going up right now, so.
Yeah.
And we do, you know, part of the transportation plan and part of one of the funding sources for the 10-year transportation plan is
Right.
was anticipated to be mobility fees.
Exactly. And you still only have that at 5 million. We thought mobility fees would bring in more than that every year.
I think we may be still winding down some of our old commitments under.
Is it the
with impact
buyback
fees.
program? Is that why?
It's the buyback and it's also the grandfathering.
Yes.
Oh, the
Yeah,
grandfathering.
so we won't see anything appreciable for a few more years.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have our internal service funds. So that's where you've got your self-insurance fund and your fleet fund, basically. And so the internal service funds are, as you can see, one of the biggest slices of the pie here is health insurance, $88 million. About half of that, a little more than half of that relates to the county piece, but then you have the sheriff health insurance plan also, which is $38 million and has $38 million in reserves. We're required, being self-insured, to carry about 16, 17% in reserves. for our health insurance plan, which would be somewhere in that $20 million range. So we're a little bit above that right now. That amount fluctuates. Those reserves have fluctuated over the years. Actually, the board had to make a pretty significant infusion into the healthcare plan recently. But again, we're looking at healthcare strategies to try to balance those reserves as we go forward and keep a healthy level, but not go too high. We've got a piece there that was OPEB, other post-employment benefits. There's some requirements out there in our footnotes and our financial statements where there are liabilities that are calculated. So we're doing what we need to do to fund those liabilities over time. So every year we have dollars that are taken out of and committed to the OPEB liability. Catastrophic reserve, $95 million. There have been a couple of recent board actions that have brought that balance down. It's not actually $94 million now. We had a budget amendment for $17 million to help fund Hurricane Irma, the upfront cost of that before we get reimbursed. And then we had another agenda item related to the hardened facilities where we accessed another $6.8 million to start some initial planning and design for the new hardened facilities.
Commissioner Miller, you're recognized.
Let me ask a question. And is there any advantage of us? Have we ever thought about trying to combine our health insurance with the sheriff's or any other agency, or is it because of the mere fact that they may be first responders, there may be a big difference in that? Is there?
My understanding is that there was a time period when the sheriff was in our plan, and they pulled out and separated from us for their own plan.
Okay. Is there any thought process in joining back with the sheriff that maybe it would help us in the cost to employees? Maybe, I'm asking this.
We can certainly look into that, and I could get a little bit more history for you.
Okay, all right. Or, it's just a thought, other agencies around the county. I mean, if we could join forces with the school board, something along those lines. I know the school board insurance, sometimes it's kind of crazy over there, but I'm sorry about that. But I mean, if we're looking at trying to decrease the cost of insurance to our employees, not decrease the type of services we give them, but the cost for the county or the sheriff or the school board, and then the cost for employees themselves, what kind of what advantages would be if we're willing to sit at the table and try to join forces and come up with one insurance plan with those agencies? Maybe that could save us some dollars too. Just throwing that out.
And I believe that's my last slide.
I wanted to ask one last question. Is there the impact of a wait list that we have in social services, which is in the countywide, is that factored into any of these charts?
No, it would not be.
You mean funding the wait list?
Mm-hmm.
No, they're not.
Okay, I'm thinking maybe we should consider that because those are going to continue to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And either we've got to change the services or do something to help
Mm-hmm.
mitigate, the impact of what, those will be. And I'm always thinking of aging because of meals.
Right.
That's probably one of our fastest growing populations right now is
Mm-hmm.
60 and up. So, and it's just the cost in social services periods going up.
Yep.
And I think that's why I know you're coming back to us
Mm-hmm.
next year, taking a different approach, a
Mhm.
different look at it, which I think is needed. But still, I don't think it's going to change the demand.
Probably, it'll only get bigger because population's
Right.
expanding. So for this year, this fiscal year we're in now, we added $1.5 million
Right.
to try and address the waiting list. So the waiting list is like, Tracy, is 3,000? So the waiting list in aging services is 3,000. To take 500 off of that waiting list is about $3.2 million. So I want to try and in this budget for next year to eat away at more of that. I don't know whether we can do 3 million, but at least another $1.5 million, but it's, yeah, it's expensive, but it's showing good results. All of
Oh,
our programs are, yeah.
Yeah, and there's going to be more demand because people want to stay in their homes. They don't
Yeah.
want to go to nursing homes.
Right.
And so we happen to have a very robust, great program to help seniors stay in their homes, and that demand's going to get higher over the
Exactly.
years.
Yep.
So, Commissioner Higginbotham?
Thank you.
You're
And I think,
recognized.
Bonnie, if I recall, it was about 2009 when the sheriff and the county split, and that was about the time of the discussion for self-insurance, maybe. But
I think that's probably right, because going back to what Commissioner Miller was saying, part of it is that we are self-insured, and so we have to consider the types of expenditures that we have within our plan. So I do know, I came in 2011, it had happened before I arrived, so that sounds about right.
yeah. And OPEB, what is that?
Other post-employment benefits, so there are accounting standards out there that are fairly recent that.
I knew it was employee benefit, I just couldn't remember the.
Yeah, it's the, we provide health insurance opportunities for our retirees, and so, trying to remember the terminology. So basically, they're able to purchase the health insurance from us at I don't want to say a discount, but there's a value to them for purchasing the health insurance from us, and that's tied to this annual OPEB calculation. So we have a consultant that comes in every year and calculates for us
I've
what that
become
liability is.
I've become familiar with that.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I see no further comments. Are we done with presentations?
Yes, we are, and we have some questions to follow up on. We'll get
Okay.
those back to you. Do we have another workshop scheduled? I know we have them on the calendar, but I guess the question would be,
The next,
We've got another one in May, two in May, I believe, dates on the calendar. We don't have anything, topics yet for any of those, but.
so I think what we'll do is, as a result of this meeting, we'll get back to you individually and give you some time to think about whether you want anything in additional workshops. If not, that's fine too, but appreciate all the good questions and discussion today, so thank you.
well, I think this is a good time in the off year to look at policies. Commissioner Miller brought up some good ideas, and Commissioner Kemp, all of us did, brought up some good ideas. So this will probably be a good time. So going into your 2-year budget, you're ready to go. Okay, great. We're adjourned.